All right, everybody, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And folks, this one is going way back.
Way back.
I'm talking like before Wisconsin was even Wisconsin.
Before cheeseheads roamed the earth.
Exactly. We're talking about a time when the landscape was dotted with these mysterious mounds built by people we don't know a whole lot about.
Yeah, and luckily for us, we've got this amazing 1855 survey report called Antiquities of Wisconsin by a guy named Increase A. Lapham.
Increase A. Lapham, now that's a name.
It really is, and you know what else his work is? More than just a report, it's like a window into the past.
Okay, I'll bite what makes this Lapham guy so special.
So picture this.
Yeah.
It's the mid-1800s, right? Wisconsin's still pretty wild, and Lapham, he realizes that these mounds, they're disappearing faster than you can say cheese curds. Yeah, and he knows he's in a race against time to document them before they're gone forever.
So talk about pressure.
Right.
But what was he actually writing down? I mean, am I wrong for imagining just a bunch of dirt piles?
You'd be surprised he was meticulous.
Meticulous? How so?
He was recording locations, measurements. He was sketching these mounds out, even comparing them to similar sites in other states.
So basically he was like the Sherlock Holmes of mounds.
There you go. Elementary, my dear Lapham.
But speaking of the mounds themselves, they weren't all just, shapeless piles of dirt, right?
Oh, absolutely not.
And actually, we've got some of Lapham's illustrations up for our listeners right now, and wow, things get pretty wild.
It's true. You've got your basic conical mounds,
Yeah.
Your embankments, those are pretty standard. But then you get these animal shapes.
Animal shapes. Okay, now you've got to tell me more about these animal shapes.
We're talking birds, bears, turtles, even panthers. I mean, just sprawling across the landscape.
Hold on, panthers in Wisconsin?
Hey, you said way back.
All right, point taken. So it's like prehistoric landscaping they had going on.
It really is incredible.
But seriously, what was the deal with these animal mounds? Were they just artistic expressions, or was there like a deeper meaning behind them?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that Lapham himself struggled with.
Because, I mean, it's not like they were just doodling in the dirt with a stick, right? These things were huge.
Exactly. These were massive earthworks. Obviously took a ton of effort and planning.
Which makes you think there's got to be some kind of meaning behind it.
Right, and that's where things get even more interesting when we look at places like Aztalan.
Aztalan. All right, that one rings a bell. But refresh my memory, what's so special about Aztalan?
So imagine this, a sprawling walled city covering over 17 acres with these huge pyramidal mounds just rising up inside.
Whoa, okay, that's a little more than just a pile of dirt.
A little bit, yeah. Lapham himself was blown away by the scale of it and the complexity.
So it wasn't just a random collection of mounds. This was planned out like a city almost.
Exactly. It suggests a level of organization and sophistication that really makes you wonder about the people who built it.
Okay, so I'm definitely picturing something out of like Indiana Jones right now.
Well, there you go.
But what were they actually using this Aztalan place for? I mean, was it just to show off how good they were at building stuff, or was there more to it?
Well, Lapham actually found human skeletons in some of these mounds, which tells us they were definitely used for burial rituals.
Okay, so it was like a giant cemetery. Then again, maybe not just a cemetery.
Right. He also found pieces of pottery tools, other artifacts. So clearly it was more than just a place where they buried their dead. It seems like Aztalan was a really important center for their culture. A place for ceremonies, maybe even trade.
Trade? You're telling me they had like a prehistoric swap meet going on?
Well, maybe not a swap meet, but the possibility of trade is really fascinating because it means they were connected to other groups, potentially sharing ideas or goods across long distances.
That's incredible. Just imagine the stories those ancient Wisconsinites could tell.
I know, right? And what's even more interesting is that Lapham, he saw some similarities between Aztalan and these other structures he had heard about, down in Ohio and even further south.
So maybe they weren't just trading pottery and stuff. Maybe they were trading ideas or architectural designs.
It's possible.
Oh.
And it really makes you think about the kind of network they might have had.
A prehistoric social network? I love it. But hold on, let's go back to those caches that Lapham keeps mentioning in his notes. You know those hidden storage pits?
Oh, yeah, those are like little time capsules just buried in the ground.
So what were they stashing in there? Winter supplies, forbidden love letters? What are we talking?
Well, Lapham found evidence of food storage things like seeds, nuts, the essentials.
So they were planners. They were thinking ahead.
Absolutely. And that makes sense, right? They had to be prepared, especially in Wisconsin winters.
I mean, imagine trying to survive a Wisconsin winter without a good stock of cheese curds. I mean, whatever the prehistoric equivalent was.
Right. You'd need a good cache for that.
Exactly. But speaking of caches, do we know if they were hidden for a reason? Like, did they have enemies? Were they worried about someone raiding their stash?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of how these ancient societies were structured. Were they peaceful, or were they constantly on edge?
So were these caches more like panic rooms or just, prehistoric pantries?
Well, some of the sites Lapham documented do seem to be built for defense. Like there's one at Iron Creek that looks like it was designed to be a fort.
So they weren't afraid to throw down if they had to.
Apparently not. But then you have other sites like Asdaland, which seem much more ceremonial, less fortified.
Interesting. So maybe they weren't just warriors. Maybe they were diplomats, artists even.
Exactly. It really paints a picture of a much more complex society than we might imagine.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more.
And that's what makes it so interesting, right? You've got these sites that seem built for defense, and then others like Aslan that seem to be more about ceremony and gathering.
Okay, so maybe more like a prehistoric music festival than a battlefield?
Maybe something like that, but instead of bands, you've got rituals and ceremonies going on.
Right, and giant mounds instead of stages.
Exactly.
Great.
And speaking of those mounds, let's talk about those animal-shaped ones again, especially the ones Lapham called man mounds, because they have these really strange proportions, like those stick figure drawings.
Right, like they ran out of space when they were making the arms and legs?
Yeah, it's definitely a unique style. And one of the things that puzzled Lapham was that he rarely found artifacts buried with the mounds, like you see in later Native American burials.
So it wasn't like they were getting buried with all their favorite stuff. No ancient Wisconsin version of a smartphone buried with them.
Not exactly. And that got Lapham thinking maybe they had different burial practices, or maybe the offerings they buried were meant to decompose naturally. Things like food or flowers.
Oh, so maybe those mounds were more like offerings to the spirits returning to the earth as nature intended.
That's one interpretation. And it really speaks to a different way of thinking about death and the afterlife.
Right. It's like they were saying, we were here, we lived, we left our mark, literally.
Exactly. And that mark has lasted for centuries. Just imagine these mounds have been standing there through all kinds of weather-changing seasons, slowly being reclaimed by nature.
It's like they have stories to tell if only they could talk.
And sometimes the stories overlap. Lapham describes finding a modern Native American grave that was built right on top of an ancient mound.
Oh, wow. That gives me chills. It's like this direct link between the past and the present.
It really is. And it highlights the continuity of human experience, how each generation builds upon the legacy of those who came before.
Okay, so we've talked about mounds in southern Wisconsin, but Lapham's survey took him all the way up to Lake Superior, right? What did he find up there? More mounds.
He did find mounds, but he also stumbled upon something really extraordinary evidence of ancient copper mining on a massive scale.
Hold on, are we talking like pickaxes and hard hats here?
Think even bigger than that. We're talking huge excavations, tools, remnants of wooden bowls they used to bail water out of the mines.
Wow, so these weren't just casual weekend hobby miners, they were serious about their copper.
Absolutely. It seems like copper was incredibly important to them, whether it was for tools, weapons, or something else entirely.
It makes you wonder what they would have thought of those giant copper stills they use to make cheese vats today.
Right. Talking about a blast from the past.
Yeah.
But the question is, were these the same people who built the mounds, or are we talking about a totally different group of ancient Wisconsinites?
Right, because being good at digging mounds doesn't necessarily make you a master copper miner.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Lapham found those distinctive stone axes near the copper mines, the same kind he'd seen near the mounds further south.
So maybe they were at least sharing tools, if not tips and tricks.
It's possible, which suggests some level of connection between these different groups.
Fascinating. But let's be honest, were these ancient Wisconsinites just mound-building, copper mining workaholics, or did they have any other interests?
Well, you know what they say, all work and no play.
Makes Jack a dull boy.
Exactly, and it seems like these folks knew how to have a good time, or at least they appreciated the finer things in life, because Lapham found fragments of pottery near both the mounds and the villages, some with really intricate designs.
So they had an artistic side.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
Which just goes to show, they weren't just focused on survival. They had a culture, they had creativity, and they expressed it through art.
It's amazing how these little fragments of pottery can tell us so much about a people who lived thousands of years ago.
It's like each piece is a little puzzle piece, and when you start putting them together, you get a glimpse into a whole other world.
A world that we're still trying to understand. But thanks to people like Lapham, we're getting closer all the time. It's like we've stumbled onto this incredible mystery, and we've only got a few pieces of the puzzle.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, trying to piece together who these people were, what their lives were like.
Right, because we've got these mounds, the copper mines, the garden beds, it all points to this pretty advanced society, and then poof, They're gone.
Well, not exactly gone. It's not like they just vanished overnight.
Okay, so what happened? Did they pack up their mounds and head south for the winter?
Huh. I wish it were that simple. But it seems more likely that a combination of factors led to their decline or maybe even their transformation.
Transformation? What do you mean?
Well, think about it. Even back then, the climate was changing. Resources might have become scarce. And that can put a strain on any society.
Right, like, imagine if the cheese curds ran out. I mean, that would be a game changer.
Exactly. So they might have migrated to new areas, or their culture might have gradually merged with other groups.
So it's less of a disappearance and more of a blending.
Right, kind of like how ingredients blend together in a recipe.
Yeah.
You might not taste each one individually anymore, but they all contribute to the final flavor.
I like that analogy. So maybe those ancient mound builders didn't just disappear. Maybe their traditions, their knowledge, their way of life, it all became part of something new.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to study these ancient cultures. Because they're not just separate, isolated groups. They're all part of the same human story.
A story that continues to unfold even today. And speaking of stories, that's what makes Lapham's work so incredible. He captured a glimpse of these people's lives, a snapshot of their world before it was lost to time.
Exactly. He was like a time traveler armed with a notebook and a whole lot of curiosity.
And luckily for us, he wrote it all down because otherwise, who knows? We might be standing here today wondering if those mounds were just giant anthills.
Right. It's a good thing Lapham had a hunch and decided to investigate.
He really did. And you know what I find so inspiring about all this is that it reminds us that history, it's not just something that happened in the past. It's still happening all around us.
Absolutely. And every discovery, every artifact, every story we uncover brings us one step closer to understanding who we are and where we come from.
And maybe even where we're going.
Exactly. Who knows what other mysteries are still out there just waiting to be unearthed?
Right. That's the beauty of it. So to our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, never stop digging for those hidden treasures of the past.
Because you never know what you might find.
That's right, folks. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Wisconsin's ancient past. Until next time, keep exploring, and we'll see you on the flip side.